in the background.
Hi, I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today I'm really happy to be speaking with Ulises Mejias, who has written Off the Network, Disrupting the Digital World. If you're not yet familiar with it, this is a really fascinating book that combines theories and theorists in post-colonial studies with questions of contemporary technology, social networks, Web 2.0. If you're interested in the books that have inspired and helped Ulises think through this kind of work, please check out tinapp.org for his 5 recommended readings. That goes for any interview that we've had. Thank you so much, Ulises, for being on the show today. Let's get right to it. I'm curious, what do you think you really got right in terms of what you were thinking about, what you were potentially worried about, and what, if anything, looks different than it did in your head 5 years ago?
Yeah, well, that's a good question because I've been thinking about what has happened since the book came out. And, 2013, and obviously I had spent a couple of years writing the book. Back then, I think it felt like those of us doing critical internet studies were still a smaller group. Actually, I shared a draft of the book with someone, a known scholar in the field. And his reaction was like, well, this is great because nobody or not many people in the United States are writing about this kind of stuff. I think the perception was that maybe Europe, in certain critical circles, some of these things were being discussed. But it didn't feel like there was a mass demand for this kind of work. And I guess you can sort of tell where I'm going with this. After Snowden and after Cambridge Analytica, there certainly seems to be a lot of interest in a critique of internet companies, of all of these social media giants. So it sort of went from, this is just a very small conversation amongst the usual suspects, people interested in critical studies, cultural studies, the political economy of the internet. And then suddenly it's all over the place. I'm sure you have noticed there are articles pretty much every other day on mainstream media, some of them appearing in what we would consider mainstream or even conservative news outlets, right? I mean, Financial Times is publishing stuff attacking Facebook. So the conversation definitely, I think you would agree, has shifted. So it's kind of a weird situation to be in because I think at the time I was writing, it still felt like a lot of academia was very much pro-internet, very gung-ho about, the possibilities of cooperation, the productive, manipulation of identity, all this stuff, it was still very much seen as a positive force. The dialogue has definitely shifted.
Without a doubt, a lot of the things, if not the book entirely, has aged well in the sense that everything is applicable today. But I'm curious if you feel not just that the popularity of these kinds of discussions has increased, has the discussion itself about networks and the internet and the ethical questions behind that, has that discussion, at least in what you've witnessed, gone in a specific direction, perhaps one that you didn't necessarily see happening, maybe in light of Facebook and the election and other things that have happened lately?
Yes, I think overall it's been a positive direction. And I would also like to point out that I'm actually completing a new book right now as we speak. I am co-authoring it with Nick Couldry from London School of Economics. Mm-hmm. He's a very well-known media sociologist. Mm-hmm. And so this new project, I'll probably refer to it a couple of times during the interview. But I think, is going in this direction in a much more clear way and political way. I think I like what I'm seeing as far as where the conversation is going, but I do have a couple of concerns. I do think that attention has very much shifted politically from, these companies can do no wrong. We remember famously the motto of Google, do no evil, to now, these corporations are horrible. They need to be stopped. Many of the people that were before, in my opinion, cheerleaders of the opportunities the internet could bring about have now very easily shifted to the opposite camp and are now saying, something needs to change. What are some of the recommendations being proposed? Well, more regulation, which I think there's definitely a place for that. However, I think the main concern I have is that most of the recommendations seem to be, we need technology to solve these issues. We need more technology. We need algorithms that can easily detect, overt forms of manipulation. So Facebook and Google need to come up with better tools, or they need to hire a bunch of content analysts. So I think we're still at a place where we will need to do a little bit more critical thinking about it. And in my opinion, I think we need to confront some uncomfortable questions about how this whole system is set up before too easily kind of, saying, okay, we can just regulate it better, we can just have better technologies, and then the problem will go away. So I think, we will need to see what happens just even in the next couple of years.
It's definitely a debate that I've been following, and it's interesting to see, as you mentioned, so many people effectively saying the algorithms that were used in social media in particular and in news gathering or information gathering have really hurt public discourse. And so what do we need to fix that? We need more algorithms.
Yes.
And I think in some cases the irony is not lost on people, but in others it seems odd and unreflective. That's really what your book is about, is encouraging people to reflect more on networks and how they seem to determine certain things, or if we're just simply unaware of what's going on in the background, it feels very deterministic to a point where we cannot challenge these things, or there is no outside. So yeah, there's just more algorithms or more networks to be added to make the network that's failing us or that's not delivering what it says bigger or better in some kind of way. Have you seen since the book alternatives to these kinds of solutions of more technology or more algorithms to fix the other algorithms? Are there some viable alternatives that you've come across or witnessed?
Well, I think all alternatives are useful, whether they're practical or not. At least they give us an opportunity to think about some of these issues. But yes, I do have concern. For instance, when people suggest, well, it needs to be regulated. Well, firstly, if we look at the past couple of decades, the trend has been towards deregulation. Mm-hmm. And we're not just talking about Republican Party and conservatives. Ever since before even the Clinton administration, the move has been towards deregulation, letting these companies get bigger and bigger. Media companies have more and more power. So yes, to turn things around is going to be difficult. And more importantly, how do you regulate artificial intelligence? We're getting to a point where some of these algorithms, what they are accomplishing is incredible, sophisticated, very impressive, but at the same time, more and more opaque, right? I was reading recently about some of the stuff that goes on with Google Translate and how, yes, the translation is getting better thanks to artificial intelligence, but we don't know exactly how. We set up a system where the algorithms can sort of make improvements, but their logic is kind of, we can no longer comprehend it. We can no longer understand how they're doing that. So if that's the case, how are we going to regulate these things, right? Maybe it becomes at a very general level, kind of like Asimov's robotic rules, right? It's like, well, do no harm. But how exactly do we know when the harm is being done? So I think you get to, you can see what I'm trying to get at, which is, it's becoming increasingly complex. To that extent, it's going to be much more difficult to regulate. So yes, those are the kinds of alternatives I'm seeing right now that are being proposed. Yes, let's restructure Facebook. Like, well, yes, at one point, AT&T was broken up into smaller companies. I don't know if people are thinking about, doing the same thing, but the system is not set up to do that, right? Mm-hmm. As far as the alternatives, I do have to say, I'm not seeing a lot these days that give me hope. I've seen political parties, especially in Europe, come up with platforms for, yes, there need to be privacy. There are privacy concerns. We need to have regulation so that companies can do X and Y. I think those are good things. But I don't know, maybe because I'm mostly interested in philosophy, I think there are still some questions that we need to confront just about the nature of progress that are not very easy to answer. These are the kinds of questions I discuss with my students, right, in our classes. And they hope that at the end of the class, we will have some easy answers, but we don't. Mm-hmm. These are questions that I'm sure you confront with your students as well. And so, as you know, there's no easy answer. Yeah, I think what concerns me right now is that a lot of the people that were singing the praises of the internet have now turned around, realized what sells books right now are books that critique Facebook and Google. And but the level of analysis is still very much anecdotal. So, but that's something that, for instance, Nick and I are trying to address in our book, in our new book. So hopefully try to provide, if not specific answers, at least a framework for how do we unthink, the project that I started in this book of the network. How do we begin to unmap and unthink these technological determinisms?
Yeah, well, and that's perfect, actually. That's exactly what I was going to ask you about, is this idea conceptually of what you call in this book a structural critique or unmapping of the network. I found it interesting how much you use what I would call geographical terms, or what makes me envision geography, if not literally, then at least as metaphor. Can you say a little bit more about how unmapping works for you, and have you found that you're continuing to do this project, or have you gone in any different direction? For anyone especially who hasn't read the book, what is unmapping the network?
Well, the basic premise of the book is that networks act as metaphors and models, but increasingly as templates. So when I say to you, when I just mentioned the word network, and I use it, for instance, to describe a television network, a terrorist network, a protein network, that's kind of like a metaphor to suggest, a system, a structure of interconnected or linked entities or terms or something. We've used the word network for ages in that way. But what I'm trying to describe in the book is what happens when networks become also templates for organizing society. So if we look at Facebook as a network, it's not just a metaphor, right? It's very much architecture. It's very much a template that is organizing society, organizing citizens, individuals, into particular structures. And what becomes possible or what becomes impossible to operationalize, to enact, to do in these networks is very much a function of the software. It's very much a function of the platform, of the code and the architecture, which very quickly, it turns out, in just a matter of a decade, has become very integral to how we conduct ourselves socially. A lot of our social lives are being mediated through these platforms, through our digital devices. So I think you mentioned the word determinism earlier, and I very much see it as a form of technological determinism, which to me means we have stopped thinking about it. We can no longer understand how it works, what goes on behind the scenes. It's become this whole infrastructure that is invisible in many ways. I mean, it's visible in the sense that, yes, we have to pay our internet bill every month. It's visible in the sense that we carry these smartphones with us, and when they don't work the way they're intended to, it's very noticeable. But what goes on behind the scenes, behind the curtain, has become opaque. To me, unmapping then, to get back to your question, is about sort of pausing and taking account of what has happened, trying to understand how it has happened, and then, yes, ask ourselves, is this something we chose? Is this something we can understand and that we can sort of say, well, the way this is going, the direction that it is going, this is something we're comfortable with. 10, 15 years down the line, is this gonna be a sustainable system or an unsustainable system? So to me, that's what unmapping means. There are people, there are hackers trying to unmap networks using tools. There are artists trying to do that through all sorts of creative projects. But to me, unmapping in its very essence is a philosophical project, an intellectual project. It's something that doesn't require specific tools or sets of skills. It's something that anyone should be able to do, just confronted with the reality of where this is all going. So unmapping, yes, it becomes about questioning the architectures, questioning the way the networks are structured.
I had a weird experience reading this book because I've read it since I've started this podcast. And since I've started this, to talk a little bit about how it helps, I think, anyone reflect on what's going on with our digital age, is that a lot of the things that you mentioned and that I feel, I would say I still feel very uncomfortable with, what you call nodocentrism, right? The idea that nodocentrism, as you say, does not provide an incorrect picture of the world, just an incomplete one, because we're focusing on these networks, and then so anything outside of these networks effectively becomes invisible for what we're doing. And I had this experience where I was playing with Facebook, and then some people said that they're not on Facebook, so they'd rather, follow the podcast on iTunes or on Instagram or what have you. And so already I'm realizing that, okay, well, if I want anyone to listen to this, I'm in a small area where I don't have a lot of physical connections to a lot of people unless I travel a lot. So I need to basically connect with them via the internet. And if they're not on Facebook, then they're maybe on Instagram. If they're not on Instagram, then maybe they're on another platform or YouTube or something like that. So already I'm seeing and noticing who's on what, and that they have different sort of parameters of how to talk. Like Instagram, for example, is really a visual-based medium almost completely. There's some words, but not really. iTunes, of course, very few, if any, visuals. And so already you're speaking a little bit different languages so that you make sure that you hit these different nodes. Mm-hmm. But then just playing with Facebook advertising and these platforms, we could talk about that for a long time. I mean, it's really interesting and scarily invasive, the way that Facebook advertising and a lot of other digital advertising work by literally pinpointing, if you are a 35-year-old male living in an urban center who has a PhD, who enjoys reading Foucault and Deleuze, then...
Right.
I mean, a lot of us, I think, understand implicitly, at least I understood implicitly how this works from reading, especially criticisms of it, but then doing it, trying to say like, okay, well, I want to get the word out about this podcast, so I'm going to look for these people, and then I'm going to realize that anyone... Like if you are part of these characteristics, but you haven't filled that out on Facebook or whatever you're using, mm-hmm. You're never going to get this ad and you're never going to see it, which may or may not be a good thing. I mean, that's like me trying to attract an audience. But I'm thinking also, though, one of the reasons I picked this up was because people, I believe, on Facebook or something, some friends were talking about this, and then I thought, I should read that too. And so long story short, I'm interested in how people doing, especially the kind of work that you're doing that's critical of networks and what's going on in the way that these things are arranged, still effectively kind of use these things. I mean, I'm sure many people are buying your book on Amazon. I'm sure if people were spreading word on social media, it would be a good thing in the sense that more people would be reading this. How do you negotiate keeping a critical distance while also not really, or at least making it very difficult not to be within this network itself?
Yeah, well, I think about that a lot all the time, because you're right. In some ways, unless you're a complete Luddite, you cannot escape this infrastructure. And, I remember when I started to go to conferences and present some of this work, at some point, one of my colleagues half-jokingly said, "This is very irresponsible." You're basically trying to tell people not to go on Facebook, and then that's going to cost them in opportunities, even professionally, right? I mean, how can you get a job these days without being on LinkedIn and Facebook and all? So Yes, my stance might be somewhat radical, but I'm always very clear, even to my students. There's no way to teach about this and then start from day one telling them you should get off Facebook. That's not what I tell them at all. And if people are on Facebook, more power to them. My plan is not to get people to abandon Twitter and Google. And I myself, I'm not on Facebook and I'm not on Twitter, but I have to use Google. I use Google all the time because it's convenient. And even one of the anecdotes in the book is, at some point, our IT department in our school decided to adopt Google services because it's free for them. So at a time when public institutions are being defunded, our IT department, that was a good bargain. Why not let someone take over your whole email for you, and that way save some money. So even if I wanted to, I have to use Google for work. I use Amazon all the time. It's not that, yes, the kind of solution I'm proposing is not that you should just abandon all of these things, but that is the essential question of modernity, right? How do we live in a system and yet still critique it and yet still imagine alternatives to it without being completely utopian and, a form of escapism? I am a very practical person, I would like to think. Solutions that work start as ideas. And so I'm very much interested in this process of unthinking the network as a critical exercise, a philosophical exercise even, that we can all engage in. And so maybe, to your listeners, it would be good to kind of get a brief sort of description of what nodocentrism is and how I arrived at that concept.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I was actually thinking about that in preparation for this interview. And, there are certain things that we do as part of our work, and then we don't realize until later, perhaps, how we arrived at them. And I was thinking that, to speak personally for a few moments, I think a lot of this is shaped by my experience as an immigrant, as someone who is inside and outside at the same time. I am originally from Mexico. I grew up in Mexico City. I came to the United States to study and ended up staying. And since then, yes, it has been a process of being both inside and outside the network that we call society. And so I think, as I sat down and started to look at the book again, I did see a lot of that experience reflected in it. And, nodocentrism, in the beginning, when I was trying to explain it to people, I was using Eurocentrism as an analogy. And I'm sure you've heard that term and read about it. But yes, it's this idea that, one way of thinking becomes so dominant that we erase other ways of thinking. And so in Eurocentrism, especially in discussions about colonialism, post-colonialism, yes, we think about it as this set of ideas that have become universal, right? Certain Western concepts that have become mainstream and that have become a reality and truth with a capital T for most people in the world. And so for me, I was thinking of nodocentrism as something similar. And yes, if there's a contribution that this book makes, hopefully it's those two terms, right? Nodocentrism and paranodality. And we can talk about that one later. But those two terms are now even part of the Oxford Dictionary of Social Media. So hopefully, they have resonated with some people. So yes, this term of nodocentrism that I equate with Eurocentrism, to me, it's sort of that, it was that bridging that gap, right? That I started to see a way of thinking that was becoming so dominant that it was sort of erasing all of the other alternatives. And, the way I explain nodocentrism to my students, we can use lots of examples, but let's just think very practically of Spotify. which is something we, or many of us, use. And so, Spotify has millions of songs, tunes, and you can pretty much find anything. But not everything, right? Not every single song that humanity has produced is on Spotify. Yes, there are millions and millions of songs, but not every song. And those songs that are not on Spotify are, for all practical purposes, invisible. If you're on Spotify and you're trying to find a song and it's not there, it doesn't exist. Maybe it exists in your mind because you heard it when you were growing up or someone has told you about it. But in terms of that network, it's not mapped. It's not rendered in the network. That's what nodocentrism means to me. Only nodes deserve to be accounted for. Only the logic of the network can only visualize, can only represent nodes. We can only recognize each other as nodes. Digital objects can only exist as nodes. And something that's not on the network is, for all practical purposes, invisible. So that's, to me, I don't know if that is helpful.
Yeah.
I think starting from that experience of being in this country as an immigrant, both inside and outside, having to adopt certain ways of thinking and having to erase other ways of thinking, other parts of me, that are suddenly not, they cannot be rendered in this new context. I think that's where all of this idea came from.
That's really interesting because that makes even more sense to me now after having read this. The way that you talk about geography or geographical sort of concepts and terms and the various authors that you use make even more sense. So that's really interesting. It's funny though, because I'm coming from Canada, I'm living in the US. Yes. And so I went through this immigration process. One of the things that stuck out to me was trying to get a credit card. I don't know if you ever had this experience too. But I have talked to some people who have done, postdocs or whatever in the U.S. who are from Canada, and we've all had this experience where, first of all, I don't know, what was I, 27 when I came here, and so I had been using a Visa card in Canada, and fine, I didn't have any bankruptcy or whatever. But then I go here, try to get a credit card, try to get a Visa card, and they basically treat me through no fault of their own, the tellers or whatever, but through the bank, basically effectively say that I don't exist, and since I don't exist, I can't have a credit card. I say I've had one for at least 10 years now. I have good credit, like I haven't missed payments or whatever. I have this job here. That's why I'm here. I'm physically here. I can bring my contract or whatever. I won't go into all of it, but you see where, if you do not fit into the criteria of checkmarking, sort of how many years have you been in Georgia or how many years have you used a Visa card? If you can't check those boxes, you effectively don't exist. And it was the craziest thing.
Yes.
When I finally did get like a, really bad credit card that gives you no points, it would charge incredible interest if you ever missed a payment, all this kind of stuff. Now, critically thinking about it, I understand how all of this works, and through work like your own, I can better articulate some of those issues and problems. But at the same time, I feel a little bit gratified every time I check my credit card score and it goes up. And because I feel like, okay, now I have a 3-year history, or now I have a 4-year history, and I better keep working this system so that if I buy a house, I don't get a shitty interest rate. If I try to do whatever, they know that I exist because I have this membership and I have this house, and I'm not going to move so that way I can have at least one more year as a history so that I'll look good on this program.
Yes.
And so, like, intellectually, I understand just how bad that is, in the sense of like trying to live your life without these kinds of constraints. But in a practical level, I want to be able to, get a good mortgage rate, or I want to be able to purchase a car or what have you. And so I'm very interested now in what are the criteria that gives me a better credit card score, and how can I work that? And I definitely don't want to do something like change states right now, or go back to Canada for too long, or whatever the case may be, right?
Right.
So it seems very deterministic, because I'm not going to change the visa system,
right.
At least not now. I wish I could. It seems like anyone who's vulnerable in particular, especially immigrants, especially people with marginal credit scores, or whatever the case may be in whatever system we're talking about, it seems like they really have to play these systems up much more so than people who sort of naturally seem to fall into them because of where they are, how they exist. How do you not fall into this trap of thinking deterministically? How do you not simply say, this is a incredible, huge system that has the potential to make my life better or effectively ruin my life? I better play this system and I better fall in line exactly to where these nodes are and make sure that I appear perfectly in the way that the system is looking for me. It's very hard.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how to keep a critical distance, but also not fall into this determinism? Because I feel like it's very easy just to say, I better fall in line.
It is very easy. And it's kind of like playing a video game, right? You start to discern the logic of the algorithms. Mm-hmm. And then you start to obviously act in a particular way to game the algorithms in order to achieve your objectives. And I think we do that in our daily lives these days when we participate in these digital systems. We know what we need to do in order to get more likes on Facebook. We know what we need to do to get more followers on Twitter, so on and so forth. So, but I don't know, as you were talking, I was reminded of a very interesting anecdote one of my students told me in class, because this system is becoming very pervasive, right? And it's not just about social media and Facebook. It's becoming about everything, including, for instance, applying for jobs. And so we were having this conversation in class about how these days, applying for a job basically means, obviously a particular kind of job we're talking about. It means filling out questionnaires, and then those questionnaires are going to be analyzed by an algorithm. And so this is becoming more and more prevalent. And basically, it's kind of like a personality test. A computer looks at it and then determines whether you're a good candidate for the job. So my student went and applied for a job. She had a good interview with the manager. But at the end of it, the manager said, I really like you. I think you would be great for the job, but I cannot hire you. And so the student was like, why? And said, well, the manager said, you basically answered this particular question on the questionnaire in a way that the computer triggers, a red flag when people answer it this way. So even though I like you, the system will not let me hire you because you answered this particular question in a particular way. And so then you realize, what's at stake. Even if we want to not participate on Facebook, cancel our Instagram account, this way of thinking is becoming so embedded in society. In particular, it affects particular populations, especially the poor and the vulnerable. When you and I go interview for jobs, hopefully we will have a very different experience. But for the kind of jobs that pay minimum wage, etc., it's a very different world. And so to go back to your question, I don't know that we can opt out. I don't know that we can, choose to live very differently. But at the end of the day, I think there are some individual choices we can make. And, you were just talking about credit cards. And it made me think of banks. At the end of the day, maybe we do have a choice whether we want to bank with a multinational, corporation or use a credit union, which exists not to increase the profits of the corporation, but to serve its clients, right? Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to make it seem like, maybe if we just start recycling, then we will solve the global warming problem. But at the end of the day, maybe there are individual choices we can make. In my case, yes, it has meant saying no to Facebook, even though I know that I cannot say no to Amazon or to Google. But that is one choice that has allowed me to regain some agency, to feel like, I might be forced to play by certain rules, but not all of the rules. It does become then about mental exercise, a philosophical exercise of, even if you're using Facebook, be aware of what it means, be aware of the implications.
Well, then let's talk a little bit about the philosophical ideas underlying some of the work that you're doing. Who or what has helped you most in thinking through these ideas? Maybe from beginning to end, who have you found that you've been turning to intellectually for help? What concepts?
That again, it's kind of a story, a very long story, but I think I was fortunate. My undergraduate degree was in film and photography and visual arts. And as a part of that, I studied with people that were interested in critical studies, critical theory, in cultural studies. So I started to read some of those things, and I started really to like what I was reading, from Foucault, Derrida, and Herbert Marcuse, and, you name it. So I became very interested in critical theory. My wife teaches in the politics department, and she's originally from Pakistan. Through my relationship with her, I started to hear about and learn about and then become more interested in, not just political economy, but what we would call perspective from the global south, post-colonialism, and decolonial studies. And by the way, my new project with Nick is very much about applying this lens of coloniality to what's happening with digital media and with the internet, and trying to make sense of it from that perspective. That body of work, people anywhere from, anyone from Paulo Freire, to Frantz Fanon, to you name it, all of the post-colonial intellectuals, both from Asia as well as Latin America. So all of that knowledge, I think, influenced this work. And in rereading of the network, preparing for this interview again, I was looking at the book. And one of my favorite sections is the section that talks about how our social imagination has been colonized. So I do think that when we think about the network as a model and as a template for organizing sociality, obviously that is a model that comes from someone's imagination, Mark Zuckerberg's imagination. And now that model has, we have all replicated it, and it now lives inside our heads. So I do see a certain kind of, colonial model at operation here. Not just Mark Zuckerberg, of course, but, in terms of the corporate ethos of how our social life should be conducted these days. And in many ways, this book is, as I say, I think it's at the end of chapter 1. It is a book about othering. It is a book about conceptualizing difference. And I think the example I use in the book is about noise. I don't know if you remember that part, that, we used to think of this model of communication from two people, but there was always noise involved. And then thanks to digital technologies, we did away with noise because, we could filter it out. We could just make the exchange of communication much more direct and without interference. And to me, at least at the level of metaphor, something was lost there, because noise always communicated the presence of an other. It communicated the presence of something that was part of the system that, even though you tried to get rid of it, was still there, was that background hum, right, that you couldn't eliminate. Mm-hmm. And it communicated, a presence of something that was demanding to be heard in some ways, reminding us that there's something else in this exchange that you cannot eliminate completely. I think digitality has eliminated that noise and maybe eliminated a way for us to think about, there's this exchange that can happen digitally, but there are other things in the background, other costs, other entities that are in danger of disappearing, of being obliterated by this model, the nodocentric model, but that will refuse to go away. And so then that brings us to my other concept of paranodality.
Well, and why don't you say a little bit about that, and then I'd love to ask you a few things about it.
Okay. So the other concept, we have nodocentrism. I think that was the idea that, the network can only see nodes. Nodes can only recognize other nodes. Mm-hmm. But then towards the end of the book, I propose this other model, which is, yes, let's imagine a network, that visual that most of us have seen many times. So it's a bunch of little dots connected by lines. But let's shift our focus to the space in between those nodes, to the space in between the lines, because that space is not empty. It's not desolate. It's not unpopulated. That space, which before used to be occupied by noise, there's still something there. There are still things that when you bypass 2 points, the distance, you might be able to bypass that distance, but there's still something that you are crossing that you cannot completely eliminate. And so to me, that is the idea of the paranodal, which is actually a term that comes from biology, not to get into too many scientific details, but basically our brain, our neurons, they are surrounded by other cells that are not part of the neuron. And so they're not part of the network, but they still play an essential role. So to me, that space between the nodes is very important because it's the only space from which we will be able to disidentify from the network. It is the only space from which we can assert an identity that is different from the node. It is the space of noise, as I was just talking about. It is the space, the part, I think I paraphrase Jacques Rancière, it is the part of those who have no part. So yes, we have these structures, these very complex, sophisticated network structures, but the paranodal will always exist, will always force the network to structure itself in a particular way. So that's why it's so important. So yes, I mean, to go back to our examples, just because I don't use Facebook, maybe I represent a paranode vis-a-vis Facebook when it comes to that network. If you're trying to contact me, like you said, the podcast is ready and you want to let me know that it's ready and you post something on Facebook, I will not be aware of that information because I do not exist. Because of nodocentrism, I do not exist to you within Facebook. Yes, I am part of other networks. You can send me an email or, whatever. And so it doesn't mean that we should be, not part of all networks, of any network, because that is impossible. But that is where a notion of difference and of claiming an identity comes in, because yes, by choosing not to be on Facebook, I'm taking a particular political stance. And maybe it's mostly pointless to most people. And maybe it means I'm missing out on what my family back in Mexico is doing because, they're all on Facebook and that's how they're posting pictures of babies and stuff. So I am missing out, but it is political and it's a philosophical stance. And so to me, that's important. It's the only place from which we can say no to the network, the paranodal.
It strikes me as interesting the way that you use a lot of post-colonial theory and writers because, well, first of all, I didn't anticipate that necessarily picking up the book. The focus, at least for me, what I was coming to it for and the title of Off the Network, I was thinking a lot about digital structures and the other aspects of your book, of course. But I was interested, once I started reading it, about how you make these links to colonial history and to post-colonial thinkers that not necessarily a lot of people talking about computers or networks are going to do. I found that very productive, and it was interesting to think about how colonial eras, it seemed like the other was the focus in order to create, Said's Orientalism, for example. The focus was on the other in order to create the white European culture. In other words, to say that we European are normal, the focus was all on the other. It seems like today in these networks, the other is simply rendered invisible. And I'm wondering if you found that in taking post-colonial ideas and theories and criticisms and applying them to our contemporary networks, have you found differences that are either productive to think about or challenging to think about in the way that we've moved from couple hundred years ago to today and the technologies we use?
Yeah, well, that's, sort of what this new project is about, and not to do, a preview, too much of a preview, or rather maybe, yes, I should do a little bit of a preview of the new work.
Yeah, go for it.
And, even though it might feel too much like an advertisement, encouraging people to buy the new book. but which hopefully will come out next year, by the way. So, but that is precisely what we're trying to do, because I think, in Off the Network, I started to play around with these ideas, but then in conversations with Nick Couldry, these ideas were developed to the next level. And that's what the new book is about, because I think colonialism, we're basically defining something we call data colonialism, which is basically, yes, this emerging capitalist order for the extraction and the appropriation of social resources through data. So we do find this model of colonialism very productive, applying it to the current context. Because if you think about it, colonialism was about extraction, right? First of natural resources and also of human bodies, right? Of labor, slavery, and colonial subjects. We are arguing in this new project that the current colonialism is about the extraction of social resources. The fact that our lives are so completely enmeshed with this system, and data is being mined, which is a very colonial metaphor. Data is being mined from everything that we do, not just online, because now we carry these devices with us throughout our day. So our entire lives are being sort of commodified, and data is being extracted from it and turned into profit. So this is something that is just happening, I think, that we're starting to understand. And we're proposing this model of colonialism as a very productive model for thinking about it. And maybe, it also kind of puts things into perspective, right? Because we've had 500 years of colonialism, and the legacy, we're still living with it, right? I mean, yes, countries got their independence in the last couple of centuries. So in some ways, you could say that colonialism is over. But the legacy of colonialism is not over. And that's what post-colonial and decolonial authors argue, right? And we need only to look at the underdevelopment of the global South to see how the legacy of colonialism is still very much having an influence. So when you look at my native Mexico, the reason it's a third world country is because of its colonial history. We have had 500 years and we have made some progress, but it's not like we can just very easily negate that history. And so I think that serves as a very useful lesson, historical lesson. These processes that are in place, the players might be new, what we're calling the social quantification sector. All of this sector of industry, Facebook, Google, the manufacturers of smart devices, the companies that aggregate and analyze data. All of this sector is new, but the trends are continuing. They have a history that has to do not just with capitalism, but with colonialism, with this extractive mentality. The new resource to be exploited is social life. And there's a lot of it, and companies are really going crazy. They're going to town because they say this resource is just there. It doesn't belong to anybody, even though that's kind of absurd because obviously it's our data, it's our social life, but they are extracting it and appropriating it in a way that I think is very reminiscent of the first wave of colonialism, of the way in which these corporations went to the third world and basically said, this land now belongs to us, whether you like it or not, and started a whole process of extraction. So that's, hopefully that will sound like an interesting project, and that's basically what we're doing in our new book.
No, for sure. No, I thought the idea that you raised in this one about digital enclosure and sort of taking what seems to be a common ground, even if it's a metaphorical thing in relation to the internet, and owning it, or at least attempting to own it and its infrastructure, was a really useful way of thinking about how things are working. To play sort of devil's advocate, if you were to approach this sector Mark Zuckerberg and others as examples and accuse them of this, or they feel accused of being the new colonialists, I could see them saying that they have not gone anywhere and they have not taken anything that wasn't just simply given to them. How would you sort of respond to that? The neoliberal mentality, I would say, of saying like, people have come to us and are using our product. Nobody has been forced to do anything.
Sure.
There's no such thing as slavery in this economy. How do you negotiate that?
Well, you're right. And at the end of the day, we all click the little box that says, I agree to the terms of use, right? Mm-hmm. So there is no coercion in that way. There is no violence. And I do want to be very clear that what we're saying is the analog with colonialism is not about the form or the content of colonialism. Obviously, colonialism looked very different then, and it had a very different cost. But it's about the function. It's about the function of colonialism, and that is the extractivism. And, what's interesting is once you start thinking about all of these things, like in the new book, we have all of these anecdotes. For instance, all of the mines in Mexico where tons and tons of gold and silver were extracted from Latin America and taken to Spain. And if you go to some of these churches in Spain today and you see all of the opulence and magnificence, you know where it came from. What's interesting is that legally, I was doing a little bit of research into this. By Spanish law, the mines belonged to the indigenous people in Mexico. And the law said that they could not be exploited. So that's where you start to realize the immense disjuncture between, the idealism and what actually went on in reality. So, yes, the terms of use of the mines was, where this belongs to Mexicans, this belongs to the indigenous people, but at the same time, they were being exploited to death. And yes, nobody in this day is being exploited in that same way. But again, if we look at the function, which is to extract all of this, then that's, I think, where we have to start becoming concerned. And at the same time, I think we're already seeing, for instance, in India, another great colonial example, and Facebook went there and they said, let us bring you free internet. Now, again, what could be wrong with that? You're taking a country with lots of poverty, maybe not a lot of infrastructure, and you're coming there, full of goodwill and saying, we will give you free internet. And Indian civil society said, no, thank you. And Facebook was, they were shocked. And there were a couple of comments, from the board and saying, how dare they, anti-colonialism has never worked. Why start now? But civil society said, we don't want, and you know what I'm talking about, right? The free basics. Yeah. What's it called? Free basics? The Facebook project that basically says, yes, you can have free internet, but basically you can only access Facebook and a few other websites. And we're going to track everything that you do. So so you create a huge and growing population for advertisers. You create Facebook users, the people who finally have access to the internet in India. It's basically just because they become Facebook users. And yes, you can say from the perspective of Facebook, well, so what? You're still gaining something. But that's where I think, this colonial metaphor starts to become useful in terms of, allowing the subjects to basically take stock of what's going on and be able to say whether they indeed want this or not.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really interesting connection that I hadn't thought very much about until reading this work, and I look forward to reading the next work. Would you have any advice, I guess, for these subjects, both you and I and people in India and anyone else who is thinking about how to best negotiate and work within this structure? I mean, so someone who is not, like you said, a complete Luddite who is going to get completely off the grid, but somebody who is still concerned about a lot of these things that we've talked about and wants to use the internet and be a part of these resources, but in the most, I guess, in the best way possible, in the most ethical way possible. Is there any advice for either thinking about that or using that in a way that you think is, as good as it can get at this current juncture?
Yeah. Well, it's tricky. I mean, I do think, people can join organizations like EFF, and, there's tons of them. So people can take a political activist role when the FCC is trying to get rid of net neutrality. So politically, I think there's things we can do. I think also, like I said, even if there are small choices are important. Research is going to have to become much more open. I think it's not something that Ivy Leagues or university departments need to do for us. I think it's something we need to do for ourselves. And so, I'll just give you briefly an example of a project I'm just starting. It's called Algorithm Observatory. And so you can just go to algorithmobservatory.com. And what we have right now is just a prototype. It's not fully finished. It's very bare bones. But the idea is that, yes, what Facebook or what any of these companies do, it's kind of like a black box. We don't understand how the algorithm treats us. And when we interact with it, it's at a very individual level. It's me and the box, Facebook. What would happen if we start to compare our experiences? So Algorithm Observatory right now, in this prototype version, allows people to upload Facebook ads. And then you fill out a profile, and it's all very secure because we don't keep any of your data. We do comply with data privacy regulations. So we just use some demographic information to then be able to see, okay, I live in upstate New York and I'm getting these kinds of ads. I want to see what other people around me are getting, what kind of ads they are getting. I want to see what people in other countries are getting. And so we can start to compare our experiences, and we cannot completely unveil the algorithm, but we can reverse engineer it a little bit and understand. It's like, oh, it looks like males of this particular age group in this particular location are getting a lot of these ads. And then it looks like females of this particular age group and this particular location are getting these kinds of ads. So it allows us to then start to do a little bit of research to understand what is the thinking behind the algorithm. How is it treating us? And yes, the algorithms change minute to minute. And so the results might not be valid tomorrow, the results that I can see today. But at least it's a tool that anybody can use, anybody can participate in, and become involved in this project of researching, trying to understand how all of this works. I think, maybe because I'm an educator, I think to me that's what needs to be happening more and more. In other words, we need to be not just users of these tools, but tinkerers and try to understand. And again, we cannot play around with the Facebook algorithm, but we can try to understand how it's treating us. So I think that power is going to be very important.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a really cool project. I just brought it up on my screen now, and it's a really interesting thing to think about. I think this whole thing, your work, upcoming and in Off the Network, is really valuable for people to think with and to try to, negotiate the contemporary landscape that we're in that seems more and more complex and to some extent, I guess, more and more dangerous, even when we are benefiting in a lot of other ways. Ulises, I just want to thank you for speaking to me today. I really enjoyed hearing what you had to say.
Well, thank you. This was a great opportunity to, be able to share some of my ideas. So I appreciate all the work you're doing, Chris.
Again, thanks so much for listening to This Is Not a Pipe podcast. If you haven't yet sent a review on iTunes or Facebook or any of the other social media that you're using, please do so. Share this conversation. Think about it. Pick up Ulises' book if you haven't, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks.